Well, certainly, I believe the priority has to be COVID response still and the global economic crisis that has resulted from COVID. There are clearly other matters on the agenda as well. And certainly trying to stabilize great power relations has to be an equal priority as time goes forward, perhaps even a higher one. But the immediate question here, I still believe, really is still COVID response, vaccination, debt relief for developing countries, priming Western economies so that we can try to recover together in the course of 2021. All these issues have seen some progress, but remain fundamentally, in flux and inadequately addressed to date. So I hope very much that that's been the first and most important agenda item in terms of priority.
I think you're right. I think COVID was certainly top of the agenda, and as you say, particularly vaccines. And in spite of promising financial support for the vaccine sharing program, COVAX, I didn't hear any announcement on new funding to improve greater access to vaccines, which many had hoped for. Is that a missed opportunity or something we'll have to wait for from the Leaders Summit next month?
It's a good point. I remain quite concerned that, generally speaking, the advanced economies are not doing enough on improving access to vaccines globally. And incremental increases in COVAX funds, for example, are welcome but not adequate. We need a concrete plan that can get the planet vaccinated as much as possible this year and certainly by next year. We know that there are projections, however, that this may not be completed until 2024 at the current pace. And I just think that's unconscionable. We are spending hundreds of billions and trillions of dollars in the major economies to stimulate our own recovery. And we can certainly afford to spend low tens of billions on vaccine availability for everyone. There still are complex issues to work out in terms of licensing and intellectual property, and I'm not sure exactly what the best answer is there. But in terms of just ramping up, continuing to ramp up production capability and distribution capability, I still think we're not quite treating this like the emergency that it is.
The big emergency globally at the moment is India. It's currently undergoing the world's worst surge in COVID-19 cases. But India was invited this week as a guest. Now the entire delegation has had to self-isolate after 2 ministers proved positive. India, though, isn't a member of G7. So why is it there?
Well, I think you answered your question better than I probably could. It is, after all, issue number one today, COVID response, and India is ground zero, number one, in the dilemma. Now, over time, if we want to think about where a G7 or a G8 or 9 or 10 may want to evolve in the years ahead, you would certainly expect that India would have to be a top candidate for joining that club, given its sheer size, given the size of its economy. And so I think in that sense, there's an historical logic and inevitability, perhaps, to this group enlarging and to include New Delhi at some date in the future. The fact that it's happened already, I think, is largely a manifestation of the COVID situation. And as we get into dealing with not only COVID, not only great power relations, but climate change, future threats in general, obviously the world's most populous country, as India is soon to become, last projections I saw are that would happen next year already. Certainly India needs to be at the table.
Well, I'll return to your excellent point about India actually being a member of G7 or G8, G9 a bit later. But at the moment, Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, has had a lot of criticism. The meeting took place in person after those 2 ministers tested positive. But do you think deals can only really be done when discussed person to person, face to face at this level?
Yeah, I'm in favor of face-to-face meetings. I think that we have to start to move beyond a mentality where the only overriding priority is to prevent a small risk of transmission among vaccinated people. You know, there are reasons why we build networks, why leaders talk to each other face-to-face, why there are summits and G7s, and why trust and communication need to be established. Some of this you can do virtually, but I think we all have our experiences from the last year. And I think most would recognize that it's easier to talk by Zoom or by some other remote long-range transmission when you already know someone, when you've already got a rapport, when you've already built a relationship. When you're trying to create new relationships, it's very hard to have that same kind of human connection when you're far away. And the risks of all the other things we're talking about, most of all the risks of COVID to those who aren't vaccinated yet, those risks are so great that I believe leaders should take some small risks themselves at whatever minuscule chance of transmission there still may be. There was some criticism, by the way, last week of Speaker Pelosi when she convened the joint session of Congress and President Biden spoke. And Pelosi thinned out the attendance. Only 1/8 the number of people who could have fit in that room were allowed in. They all wore masks, but they were all vaccinated. And the message that she was implicitly sending was the vaccine's not adequate. And I think that's a wrong message. I think once we get to the point where people are vaccinated, we've got to recognize that economic recovery and getting other business done, these are equal priorities. And so I think Boris Johnson was correct to have the meeting or to recommend that these meetings be face-to-face. And I hope that continues.
Coming now to the point you made earlier, President Trump was critical of G7 and said he wanted to add to the cast the leaders of Australia, India, Russia and South Korea, since he didn't think, in his words, the current very outdated collection of countries properly represented what's going on in the world. Did he have a point?
I think he did. You know, President Trump was a disruptor and he was unpredictable, and I'm glad he's not in office because I was a little bit more nervous every day about the stability of the world. But it doesn't mean he was wrong. It doesn't mean he was wrong about everything. And he certainly challenged existing paradigms on the U.S.-China relationship, some of them excessively, but some of them perhaps usefully. And I certainly think on the G7, you know, why is Italy in but South Korea out or India out? I think that one has to ask these kinds of questions. And the concept of the G7 was developed a long time ago. There have been a lot of shifts in world economic, military, and technological power since that time. And so it should be kept small enough that people can actually sit around a relatively small table and avoid the kinds of dynamics that are inevitable when you get into the multiple, you know, dozens of countries, even at a G20 or certainly at any UN meeting. So I don't want to, you know, advocate making it much bigger, but I think a G10-ish kind of community may be the way to go.
Yeah. Climate change is certainly one of the biggest challenges at the moment, perhaps second only to the pandemic. And this G7 round has been described as an opportunity to restore the rules-based international order following President Biden's recommitment to the Paris Climate Accord. What's the thinking behind that sentiment? Well,
I'm not going to give the Biden administration or anyone else too much credit just for returning to the rules-based order, because the Paris Accords are a small step on the path towards solving a huge problem. And just because we are patting each other on the back for complying with a relatively toothless treaty doesn't mean that we should feel good about what we've done. So Paris really only provides an opportunity for now more serious thinking in the years ahead. In and of itself, I'm not that impressed by people holding hands and singing Kumbaya on something that was pretty easy to negotiate and doesn't really do that much.
No. I mean, what do you think then, Michael, sort of, what does this meeting of foreign ministers set up for the summit in Cornwall here in the UK in a few weeks' time? And what do you predict we can expect from that one?
Well, by way of prediction, always dangerous in this line of work, I would be still inclined to say that the Biden team is going to be cautious on most issues, with the possible exception of COVID. I think President Biden's made it clear that his priorities are primarily domestic and COVID related. And so, for example, on a North Korea policy, which may not be a big G7 issue, but it's still a reflection of where Biden has been, the path that he's sketched out is very incrementalist, step-by-step negotiations. He did make a big decision on Afghanistan, which I happen to think was the wrong decision. But in general, on big issues of foreign policy, we see his team still being assembled very slowly. I think less than 10% of his confirmable positions are already in their seats. We're still seeing the gradual development of Biden administration thinking. So, for example, anything that I mentioned about bigger ideas on climate or bigger ideas on future security architecture for Europe that does not require Ukraine to be added to the NATO membership roster, I think those kinds of ideas will have to wait a while.
Michael O'Hanlon, the Director of Foreign Policy Research at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. Many thanks to you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.